All right, let's see what I've got today. The funeral home team, I guess the mother-daughter duo that teamed up to illegally sell body parts. So we're going to dive into this. Actually, we're going to take a look. Let me give you just a picture of them so you can see who we're talking about here. This is the mother and daughter team out of Colorado. And it looks like, from what I've been able to find out, they were funeral home owners. The mom was actually responsible for doing I don't want to say chopping up because it sounds so insensitive, but this is just terrible. I don't even know how you get to the point where you think this is not just a good idea, just an idea in general. But let's go ahead and see if we can jump over to, we're going to take a look at the indictment. We're going to take a look at the press release from the Department of Justice. There is also a Facebook page. I'll show you the Facebook page because this is really a tragedy. There were so many people in this community who turned up at court to, share their stories as victims too, when it came down to the judge coming up with a sentence. And Megan's gotten 20 years in federal prison. They pleaded guilty to fraud, sentenced for selling body parts. And this is a former funeral home director. And this picture that you see over here is a picture of the mother. And this was a 69-year-old mother. I'm not sure how you talk your mother into doing this, or want to even put your mother in a position where at that age she is doing something wrong and could possibly be sentenced to jail for what could be the rest of her life, if you take into account the life expectancy of women in this country. So it's yeah, I don't know why they did this, but let's see if we can go over to the indictment. Let's see if I can find, well, not the indictment. Let's start with the Department of Justice and their press release about some of this, to see if we can pull that up. And because this gives, I think, an overview of everything. It sort of sums everything up. And then we can go back and take a look at this Facebook page, the indictment that sort of had a few more details in it, just to get a better understanding of what was going on here, how this scheme was taking place. And again, I still don't really understand how you even do this. Just, I'm at a loss here how you do this. I don't know, but yeah. All right, so we've got Sunset Mesa Funeral Home operators sentenced to federal prison for illegal body part scheme. This is out of Denver, but I think the location was actually Montrose, Colorado. So it says the United States Attorney's Office for the District of Colorado announced today that the operators of Sunset Mesa Funeral Home in Montrose, Colorado, were sentenced to federal prison for illegally selling body parts or entire bodies without consent of the family of the deceased. Megan Hess, age 46, was sentenced to 20 years in prison after earlier pleading guilty to one count of mail fraud and aiding and abetting, according to the plea agreement from 2010 to 2018. So 8 years. The defendant and others. Okay, so I only knew about the mom, but it sounds like there may have been other people involved in this. Stole the bodies or body parts of hundreds of victims and then sold those remains to victims purchasing the remains for body broker services. Under the auspices of Sunset Mesa Funeral Directors, the defendant would frequently meet with victims seeking cremation services for themselves or their loved ones who had died. During those meetings, the defendant and others would represent to the victims that Sunset Mesa Funeral Directors would cremate decedents and provide their cremated remains back to the families. Instead, the defendant and others would harvest body parts from and prepare the entire bodies of the decedents for sale in body broker services. So I think this is, one of the questions you want to ask is the parties who were buying them, did they know that this was taking place illegally? Did they have any idea that they were engaging in this also? Because that might make them co-conspirators. Although we haven't looked at the indictment yet, so I don't know if that was one of the things that was mentioned. But when they talk about and others here, and then they say body broker services, it does make you wonder who else might have been involved in this. Shirley Koch, age 69, and that's supposedly her mother, if I understand it correctly, was sentenced to 15 years in prison. Now she's 69, so already she's going to be what, 80 something years old when she gets out. Okay, she's going to be over 80. So you have now helped your mom spend, what's probably going to be the last really good years of her life, based on life expectancy, locked up in federal prison. This is so unfortunate for everyone involved. According to, so it says after earlier pleading guilty to one count of mail fraud and aiding and abetting, and I've read a little bit about what the families are saying about this, and it's almost like a count of mail fraud and aiding and abetting does not sum up the damage that occurred to these families. It sounds so belittling almost, given the significance of what happened to these families and the number of families that were involved here. This is such a tragedy. I just don't understand. According to the plea agreement from 2010, again, it sounds like she was involved from day one then. Through 2018, Koch was involved in meeting with families seeking cremation services for their loved ones who had died. In many instances, Koch and Hess neither discussed nor obtained authorization for donation of descendants' bodies or body parts for body broker services. In other instances, the topic of donation was raised by Hess or Koch and specifically rejected by families. So now it looks like you have families who said, no, I don't want this. And it sounds like maybe they did not follow these directions. In such circumstances, despite lacking any authorization, Koch and Hess recovered body parts from or otherwise prepared entire bodies of hundreds of decedents for body broker services. In the few instances where families agreed to donation, Hess and Koch sold the remains of those decedents beyond what was authorized by the family, which was often limited to small tissue samples, tumors, or portions of skin. Hess and Koch also delivered cremains to families with the representation that the cremains were that of the deceased, when frequently that was not the case. Yeah. So you weren't even sure that you were getting back your loved one. And there's no, I mean, how are you going to know now? According to the plea agreements, Hess and Koch would also ship bodies and body parts that tested positive for or belonging to people who had died from infectious diseases, including hepatitis B and C and HIV, after certifying to buyers that the remains were disease-free. These shipments would be through the mail or on commercial air flights in violation of Department of Transportation regulations regarding the transportation of hazardous materials. And so this is where the mail fraud piece comes in, and again, and I think that's why at the beginning they categorize the parties who are receiving the bodies and the body parts as victims also, because they may not have known about some of this here, that some of these people had tested positive for other diseases, and that put them in violation of transportation regulations. All right, so the judge sentenced them on January 3rd, 2023. And here's what the judge said. The defendant's conduct was horrific and morbid and driven by greed. There you go. I mean, there's no other explanation. I don't know how else you explain what they did. They took advantage of numerous victims who were at their lowest point given the recent loss of a loved one. We hope these prison sentences will bring the victims' family members some amount of peace as they move forward in the grieving process. And that was from U.S. Attorney Cole Finnegan. The attorney goes on to say, we sincerely hope this punishment deters like-minded fraudsters in the future. Let's see. And then we have these two women preyed on vulnerable victims who turned to them in a time of grief and sadness. Now, think about that for a second. You're already in a state where, you're emotionally drained, you're grieving, you're still trying to process the loss of this loved one. And so your decision making is not at its best anyway. And so you really do rely on other people to help you make the best decision. And it just sounds like they took advantage of that just for money, just for money. But instead of offering guidance, these greedy women betrayed the trust of hundreds of victims and mutilated their loved ones, said FBI Denver acting special agent in charge, Leonard Carollo. Without knowledge or consent, the women disrespected the wishes of the grieving victims and degraded the bodies of their family members to sell them for profit. These two criminals continued in their atrocities for years. Remember, 20 yeah. What was that? What was that number again? Oh my gosh, 2010 to 2018. So for 8 years. For 8 years. All right. And degraded their bodies. See, and that's why that's why I need this right here, because I come back and I'm lost. Without knowledge or consent, the women disrespected the wishes of their grieving victims and degraded the bodies of their family members to sell them for profit. These two criminals continued in their atrocities for years, showing no remorse or contrition even after they were exposed. Nothing can guarantee solace for the victims or repair the damage done, but perhaps the sentence can mark the end of a horrible chapter in their lives. Right. There's no way to go back and fix this. You can't go back and change what they've done. And the family members now have to live with this in their heads. Like, this is always going to be there for them. Together with our law enforcement and prosecutorial partners, we are committed to pursuing those who put the safety of the public at grave risk for personal gains. We hope today's sentencing provides a sense of justice served for the families and loved ones of the victims of this callous scheme. I don't know how you come up with this and think that this is the thing that you want to do, and unless you just have such little value for life. I don't know how you do that. And here's the thing. The fact that they are a mother-daughter team that are working together on this, it's like, how do you not say, well, I wouldn't want somebody to do this to my mother, but I'm going to bring my mother in to do this to somebody else. It's really hard to wrap your head around it. It just really is. Let me see if I can pull up this indictment wherever it may be on my computer, somewhere out there. Let's see. Yeah, I don't know. I wonder if this is it. That may not be it. I'll come back to that in a minute. Let's, I mentioned to you before that there was this Facebook page that has been tracking this, I think, from early on. So I do want to take a moment to take a look at some of the information that they've been sharing there for the community, because this is a community that was really truly hurt here. It's devastating to them to have to go into court and talk about this. But this is the Facebook page that someone set up to make sure that the community could see and understand what was going on. Sunset Mesa crimes. And it says here, information and discussion about Sunset Mesa and other worldwide body broker crimes. And so, it's a recognition that there is a whole network of this that's going on, that, they didn't invent this. This is nothing new. This is nothing new. And that, they're going to now have this Facebook page to offer some information about this. And you can go to this Facebook page, learn more about it. And maybe, maybe there's some information here that can help you and your family when you're trying to make a decision about, who you're going to use. And you've got all of these news reports up here also. And this is, what I just read to you here from the Department of Justice. But yeah, you've got a whole lot here that you can check out. And again, this is nothing new for anyone. This is something that's been going on for a while, but it's devastating to sort of hear that this family went through this. But let me go back and see if I can take a moment here to find where this indictment was. This is what happens when you download things and come back later and you go, oh, well, where is that folder that I downloaded? Let's see, we might have some of it right here. Yeah, oh, yeah, this is our part of the complaint here. Let me see if I can find the main page so that I can share it with you, the indictment. And we'll go through some of that. Just so we can see a little bit more about what was going on. And maybe, maybe it offers us an opportunity again to come up with some ways, some things to think about. And again, it's hard because you're already in this space where, you're traumatized, you've lost a loved one, and now you have to wonder, if I take my family to this funeral home, am I going to get the services that I think I'm getting? Am I even going to get back the remains from a family member who is supposed to be cremated? Is that going to happen or not? It's something that you have to think about. And I tell people all the time, if you feel like there are red flags when you're talking to someone, then you probably need to take another look at that and think about what it is that's going on. Because I tell people, those red flags, those gut instincts that you feel about another party, they usually mean something. It usually matters. So we've got the indictment here for the mother-daughter team. Let me open this up so that I can actually see it a little bit better and I'm not struggling to read here. We've got the indictment here. Grand jury charges. Okay, so here's the background. And it says Sunset Mesa Funeral Home was a nonprofit corporation incorporated in the state of Colorado, organized exclusively for charitable, religious, educational, and scientific purposes. And this language was in their nonprofit corporation information because that's your purpose if you're a nonprofit. And its purpose was to purportedly to provide assistance to community members who have no resources for funeral cremation services. And it says it was formed by defendant Megan Hess on or about May 4th, 2009, and then dissolved in 2018. So, that date is in line with the year of when the FBI, when the Department of Justice press release says that they stopped doing that. So on or about May 28, 2009, Hess created a trade name known as Donor Services. Donor Services' primary source of income was harvesting and marketing for sale purportedly donated human remains. And you see there where they said purportedly, okay? She was letting people know that they were donated, but it's not necessarily the case that they had been donated. There was very limited, if any, authorization to do so. Purportedly donated human remains such as heads, torsos, arms, legs, and entire human bodies to customers who use the remains for scientific, medical, or educational purposes, hereinafter referred to as body broker services. At all times relevant to this indictment, has operated her services under the name Donor Services out of the same location as a funeral business operating under the name Sunset Mesa Funeral Directors in Montrose, Colorado. So she actually had both of those in the same location, Donor Services and the Funeral Directors business. And so then she registered the trade name for that. And it says from that date and continuing until February 6, 2018, Hess owned and operated a funeral home providing burial and cremation services under the SMFD name. It says she was in charge of and handled most of what was going on there. It says she handled, let's see, she met with family members, met with families seeking funeral services, discussed the disposition of the deceased, and made funeral arrangements. With regard to donor services, she handled most of the advertisement, invoicing, and shipping arrangements, and dealt directly with end users or purchasers of the purportedly donated human remains. And then it says defendant Shirley Koch assisted and was involved in meeting with families and discussing the disposition also. And then it says, and processing and preparing bodies for body broker services. This is so tragic. It really is to believe that they were just driven by money to do this. It says beginning in or about 2010 and continuing on or about February 6, 2018. Now, it's interesting to wonder at what point they made the decision that this is now what we're going to do. We're going to switch from just providing good services to the members of our community to now I want some money and here's what I'm willing to do to get it. You know, it makes you wonder what caused them to make that switch in their head about just running a business to now committing fraud and engaging in it in such a manner that you traumatize these families. It says the defendants, Hess and Koch, devised and intended to devise a scheme and artifice to defraud and to obtain money and property from decedents, their families or representatives, and other customers by means of materially false and fraudulent pretenses, representations, and promises, hereinafter called the scheme, and aided and abetted the same. It says they would meet with families seeking cremation services for their loved ones who had died. During these meetings, they represented to families, as the families had requested, that they would cremate the decedents and provide their cremated remains, hereinafter cremains, back to the families. In many instances, they neither discussed nor obtained authorization for donation of decedents' bodies or body parts for body broker services. In other instances, the topic of donation was raised by Hess or Koch and specifically rejected. So there were these times when, yes, they brought it up to try to get this authorization, and families told them, no, we don't want that. In such circumstances, despite lacking any authorization whatsoever, they harvested body parts from and otherwise prepared entire bodies of hundreds of decedents for body broker services. So they did it anyway. They had no regard for these families' wishes, and they did exactly what it was they wanted to do. Now, some families, it says here on page 3, some families agreed to donation. Frequently, these families believed, based on representation, that only small samples, such as tumors or portions of skin, would be taken for testing or research. You know, we know that it can be helpful, especially for research purposes and for learning purposes for medical students, to have an opportunity to use body parts, samples of bodies for learning and educational purposes. I think we understand that that is the case. The difference here, though, is that I have to give you permission to do that, okay? So in this case, where families had said, oh, yes, you can take small samples, it says other families believed, based on representations from Hess or Koch, that donated remains would be used to treat living recipients. Okay, so that's one sort of thinking they had. You know, they've told them, hey, this is what's going to happen. Still, others only authorized donation for specific body parts, such as specific organs, but specifically denied donation for anything else. Frequently, in such circumstances, they exceeded the authorization they obtained. Remains would be sold for purposes not contemplated by the families, and body parts beyond those which were authorized. If not, entire bodies would be sold. In each of these instances, the families would not have authorized donation had they been informed of what would actually be done with their loved ones' remains. Okay, so let's talk about the income here. Now they're bringing this up. The income derived from the body broker services business allowed Hess to advertise rates for cremations that often made SFMD the least expensive option in the area. As a result, Hess was able to ensure a constant supply of bodies for her and Koch's body broker services business. Hess or Koch would also at times offer free or reduced rate cremations to incentivize families to agree to donation of their loved one's remains. They, or an employee at their request, would provide cremains to families, representing that the cremains delivered were that of the decedent. In reality, this frequently was not the case. In many instances, the decedent's entire body was sold through donor services. Nevertheless, the families were charged and paid typically $1,000 or more for a cremation that never occurred. These families would receive cremains replaced or supplemented by Hess or Koch with the cremains from another person or persons. You know, and I think this is probably one of the things that is traumatic, because now you have, you know, something in your house, an urn or some vase or something, and you're thinking that this is your loved one. This is your father, this is your mother, a sibling, whoever, a child, maybe even. And all this time, you have been thinking that that was your family member, only to now find out that not only did they do these other things, but you're not even sure that this is the remains of your loved one, of your family member. It said the families relied on the representation that the cremains they received were that of their loved ones in making final arrangements. I sometimes I just don't understand. Hess advertised the remains offered to by donor services to customers of her body broker services business as legitimately and freely donated, when often this was not the case. So then you have the end receiver here thinking that they're engaging in a legitimate legal business practice. In order to support such claims, Hess developed donor authorization forms that purportedly would be signed by the families of decedents when authorizing donation. In dozens of instances, records maintained by Hess and Koch for donor services and SMFD contained donor authorization forms that had forged signatures indicating a donation was authorized when that had never occurred. In hundreds of other instances, the records maintained by Hess and Koch contained no donor authorization form at all, yet the decedent's remains were nevertheless sold through donor services. All of the customers of donor services relied on Hess's representations that the remains they purchased were legitimately donated. See, that's what I'm saying. You're the end receiver here. You're going to buy something, you know, you're thinking, oh, well, this is going to be helpful for educational purposes, for research, you know, for development of medicines, whatever it is you're doing, and you think it's legitimate, you think it's legal. Can you imagine when you get that phone call or that knock on the door from the FBI and you're that end purchaser, and you now find out that this other party you have been purchasing from was engaging in this activity? Imagine you're that party and trying to figure out, you know, what is my role in this? You know, how do I look at this in the future and say, how do I vet where I am obtaining body parts from for research purposes? How do I make sure that this person is legitimate and doing the right thing? It says these customers would not have purchased the remains Hess sold had they known that the remains were not in fact donated and had instead been stolen. Many of the customers of donor services also required that the remains they received be free of particular infectious diseases, namely HIV and hepatitis. Koch would frequently draw blood from decedents whose remains were to be sold and submit that blood for testing. In dozens of instances, Hess or Koch received results indicating the remains tested positive for these diseases. Rather than inform donor services customers of this fact, Hess frequently sent these customers altered laboratory reports indicating the remains tested negative for the infectious diseases. These customers relied on these representations and would not have purchased the remains had they known that the remains were infected with these diseases. In order to fraudulently increase their profits, Hess and Koch shipped or caused to be shipped human remains from decedents who tested positive for or died from infectious diseases through the mails and on commercial air flights in violation of DOT regulations. This is in total, they received hundreds of thousands of dollars for human remains sold through donor services that were either fraudulently obtained or represented as freely donated, or were otherwise fraudulently represented as free of infectious diseases when that was not the case. And then, of course, they have the section here about the mailings. And then I had no idea this was in here. They actually go through with, you know, a listing here. This is a lot. This really is. Count 7. Yes. And it says here, all right, willfully caused to be delivered property containing category B, biological material, namely, yes, okay, which was known to have hepatitis C. I don't think we have to get into the details of that. Count 8, again, goes into what was actually delivered, and then that had tested positive for hepatitis C. And all these are in violation of DOT regulations, which is why they're going through this extent of actually listing it here in the indictment. And then there's the forfeiture allegation here. And it says, and this is what they're asking for, it says Megan Hess and Shirley Koch shall forfeit to the United States any and all of defendants' right, title, and interest in any property, constitution, and derived from any proceeds obtained directly and indirectly as a result of such violations, including but not limited to a money judgment in the amount of proceeds obtained by the scheme and by defendants. And then we have 2108. They actually have an address of some property listed here. They have a vehicle listed here. And it says if any property described above as a result of any act or omission of the defendants cannot be located. Yeah, so they go through that piece there. If they can be located, can't be found, has substantially diminished in value, then the court can seek forfeiture of any other property that may have value there. So there you have it. You know, there's the whole indictment there. You've seen this, like I said before, really just comes down to greed. That is what the Department of Justice said in its press release. They mentioned this as just money and profit motive here in the indictment. And terrible scheme. We're wishing well for the family members here, and praying for them. And like I said, the daughter is now looking at 20 years in prison. The mother is looking at 15 years in prison. So there you have it. So some takeaways here. You know, I'm not sure what I can tell you. So one thing to think about, and I tell people this all the time, you know, if you're looking about working with someone else, you know, as an attorney, I frequently tell people, make sure you vet the other party. Do your research. And a lot of times we try, you know, we go on the internet and we put the information in and we try to look up and see if they have any reviews. We see how many stars they have. Are they on Yelp? You know, are there Google reviews? What are people saying? We go to the Better Business Bureau. We try to do research. We ask for referrals from friends. And that's sort of that preliminary research. And we think we are winding up with a party that we can trust. Sometimes it is the case and it works out. I recently hired someone to cut back the trees in my yard. And who did I, who did I get? Well, guess what? I used the same people that the people across the street from me had used. And if those people had told me, no, Sheila, they suck, do not use them, then I would not have used them. But they said, oh no, they were great. So I used them. I saw them show up. I saw them do the work. I saw them clean up afterward. Looked like a good deal to me. And so once I asked them and they said, yes, they were fine to use, I then moved along with them. But we're not always going to be in the situation where we can vet other people and find out. People are good at fraud. If they want to take your money, they will find a way to do it without you ever realizing the extent that they would go through to get it. So even though we do these reviews, it's really hard. We're in a hard situation sometimes to try to understand the fraud, the level of fraud that someone will engage into to separate your hard-earned money from you. And in this case, it was driven by greed in order for them to gain money, for them to get more clients in so they could get more money, and now these families are traumatized and they're in a situation that where they're probably trying to figure out what their next step is going to be. How do they reconcile what has happened? How do they move forward? But like I said, if you're in this situation and you're concerned about, who to go with, try to get referrals. If you don't feel good about it, if your gut instinct is saying walk away, then walk away. So I hope you got something from all of this information, this tragic situation. If you got something out of this, learned, got some helpful information, go ahead and give the video a thumbs up. And don't forget to subscribe. Peace.